What if the single most powerful lever on the global climate, the structure of international trade, and the balance of world power was pulled a full generation ago? In our timeline, the year 2000 marked the quiet beginning of a climate policy stalemate. Emissions climbed by 60% over the next 2 decades. Carbon pricing remained fragmented, experimental, and politically fragile. But in this timeline, the world made a different choice. At the turn of the millennium, a binding global carbon tax was implemented, establishing a uniform price on every ton of carbon dioxide emitted across major economies. The consequences of that single policy shift ripple outward, reshaping not just atmospheric chemistry, but the architecture of global power. Instead of watching renewable technologies scale through incremental subsidies and late-stage urgency, markets were forced to price climate risk from day one. Coal retreated earlier. Innovation accelerated faster. The geopolitical race for the 21st century was never fought over oil pipelines, but over clean energy supply chains, industrial efficiency, and climate finance. This is not a story about utopia. A global carbon tax implemented in 2000 would have triggered severe short-term economic shocks, provoked intense diplomatic friction, and forced a rapid redistribution of industrial advantage. Yet the central question remains: would earlier, coordinated climate action have stabilized a fracturing world order, or simply accelerated the realignment of great power competition? Over the next hour, we will trace the economic, political, and strategic dominoes that fall when the rules of the global economy are rewritten at the millennium. The past did not happen this way, but understanding how it could have reveals exactly what is at stake today. The divergence begins not with a war, a technological breakthrough, or a natural disaster, but with a diplomatic decision made in the final months of the year 2000. In this timeline, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change convenes an emergency special session, building on the fragile foundation of the Kyoto Protocol. The result is the Global Carbon Pricing Framework, an agreement that would have been considered politically impossible in our reality. The mechanism is deliberately simple: a harmonized carbon tax starting at $20 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, with a mandatory escalation clause of 5% per year in real terms. This price applies at the point of fossil fuel extraction and to imports from non-participating jurisdictions, creating an immediate economic incentive that transcends borders. The coalition that makes this possible is narrow but strategically pivotal. The European Union, already experimenting with emissions trading, provides the regulatory blueprint. Norway and Canada, major resource exporters with strong climate constituencies, bridge the divide between producer and consumer interests. Japan contributes technological credibility and financial heft. Crucially, the United States joins this core group, a divergence that requires assuming either a Gore presidency or an unprecedented bipartisan consensus in Washington following the 2000 election. This American commitment is the linchpin. Without it, the framework collapses into another symbolic accord. China's participation is secured through critical concessions, a 10-year grace period on full tax liability, coupled with binding commitments for technology transfer and access to a newly established green climate facility, funded by a portion of global carbon revenues. Several foundational assumptions underpin this scenario, and each carries significant uncertainty. First, enforcement relies on the World Trade Organization recognizing carbon border adjustments as a legitimate trade measure, a legal precedent that would have required a landmark ruling. Second, the model assumes coverage expands rapidly, reaching 80% of global emissions by 2005 and achieving near-universal participation by 2015. This is a bold assumption, contingent on the economic and diplomatic costs of non-participation outweighing the short-term pain of compliance. Third, the framework leaves revenue recycling to national discretion but assumes that 50% of global revenues are effectively reinvested in clean technology research, development, and deployment through the new international facility. If this assumption fails, if revenues are captured by domestic politics or misallocated, the innovation dividend of the policy diminishes substantially. From the perspective of international relations theory, this point of divergence represents a rare moment of liberal institutionalism overcoming realist fragmentation. States accept short-term sovereignty costs for long-term collective gain, betting that coordinated price signals can alter market behavior faster than fragmented regulation. Yet the realist undercurrents remain. The framework is designed to advantage early movers in clean technology and to create a new form of economic statecraft through market access. The game theoretic logic is clear. join early to shape the rules and capture first-mover advantages, or face escalating costs and strategic isolation later. This is not a story of sudden global altruism. It is a story of calculated interest, where the perceived risks of inaction finally outweigh the risks of cooperation. The year 2000 becomes the moment the world priced the future, and in doing so, began to rewrite the rules of power, prosperity, and planetary stability. The immediate aftermath of the policy implementation is defined not by gradual adaptation, but by rapid market recalibration. Energy pricing adjusts almost instantaneously to the new carbon signal. Coal, as the most carbon-intensive commodity, faces a sudden structural disadvantage that triggers a sharp contraction in demand across compliant economies. Natural gas captures immediate market share as the primary transition fuel, while oil demand growth decelerates as transportation networks and industrial facilities accelerate efficiency investments. The macroeconomic transmission is direct but contained. Consumer prices experience a brief upward drift, reflecting the embedded carbon costs in logistics, manufacturing, and heating. This inflationary pressure is deliberately offset through mandated revenue recycling, which channels a portion of tax receipts directly to households and energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. The mechanism prevents the kind of runaway cost of living shock that typically triggers political reversal, allowing the market to adjust without breaking consumer confidence. Political friction emerges almost immediately, testing the durability of the new framework. Industrial corridors in the United States, resource-dependent provinces across the Commonwealth, and high-cost extraction operations within OPEC and Russia mobilize intense opposition. The argument follows predictable lines. A harmonized carbon price distorts traditional comparative advantage and functions as disguised trade protectionism. Formal disputes are filed at the World Trade Organization, challenging the legality of border adjustments and export tax equivalences. Yet the diplomatic architecture holds. Rather than fracturing under pressure, participating nations consolidate into a coordinated economic bloc. Membership grants preferential market access, shared regulatory standards, and pooled financing for industrial modernization. The underlying game-theoretic dynamic proves decisive. The cost of exclusion rises faster than the cost of compliance, compelling hesitant governments to align with the emerging regime rather than risk long-term economic isolation. The distributional consequences of this policy shift are stark and geographically uneven. Clear beneficiaries emerge almost overnight. Renewable energy developers, particularly early-stage wind turbine manufacturers and photovoltaic firms, see project pipelines expand as the carbon price tilts the levelized cost of energy decisively in their favor. Nuclear engineering experiences a policy renaissance, with previously stalled next-generation reactor designs suddenly attracting institutional capital. Grid modernization, building efficiency retrofits, and industrial process optimization enter a sustained boom cycle. The immediate losers bear the weight of structural transition. Appalachian coal communities, inland heavy manufacturing basins, and high-cost petroleum producers face revenue cliffs and rapid asset write-downs. The human and regional economic toll is substantial, demonstrating why revenue redistribution and workforce transition programs are not peripheral considerations but essential stabilizers for regime survival. China occupies the most strategically complex position during this initial phase. The negotiated grace period and technology transfer commitments cushion the immediate impact on its export-oriented manufacturing base, but the underlying market signal is unmistakable. Chinese policymakers quickly recognized that long-term industrial competitiveness will be determined by carbon intensity and supply chain efficiency, not merely labor arbitrage. The state pivots aggressively toward domestic clean technology deployment, directing carbon revenues into rapid rail electrification and early-stage battery material research. This creates a no-term drag on heavy industry margins but seeds a structural advantage that compounds over the following decade. Yet this trajectory carries inherent uncertainty. The assumption that political leadership will prioritize long-term industrial modernization over short-term growth stability is fragile. A severe global downturn, a shift in domestic political priorities, or capital flight from state-backed green ventures could fracture the consensus and trigger policy rollback. The scenario assumes disciplined state capacity, which is not guaranteed. By the midpoint of the decade, the macroeconomic data reveals a decisive inflection point. The annual growth rate of global carbon emissions is cut in half relative to the baseline trajectory of the early millennium. The policy has not eliminated fossil fuels, nor has it triggered systemic economic collapse. Instead, it has imposed a pricing discipline on capital allocation that forces technological substitution for extraction. The immediate years are characterized by friction, institutional stress testing, and the quiet reallocation of investment flows toward efficiency and low-carbon infrastructure. The initial economic shock has been absorbed, but the deeper structural realignment has only just begun. The period between 2005 and 2015 marks the transition from initial policy shock to deep structural realignment. With half a decade of consistent carbon pricing embedded into corporate balance sheets and national budgeting, the global energy system undergoes a forced optimization that fundamentally alters long-term investment horizons. Coal, once the default foundation of industrial expansion, faces an irreversible economic squeeze. Across OECD economies, the carbon price crosses the threshold where coal-fired generation becomes consistently unprofitable, triggering an accelerated retirement schedule that advances real-world timelines by nearly a decade. Natural gas absorbs the interim load, functioning as a transitional bridge, but the true market disruption comes from the rapid commercialization of renewable technologies. The persistent price signal compresses learning curves for solar photovoltaics and onshore wind, driving down costs through scaled manufacturing, iterative engineering, and competitive procurement. Grid parity arrives years ahead of historical projections. Simultaneously, the policy environment reignites nuclear development. As baseload reliability and zero-carbon credentials align with long-term utility planning and grid stability requirements, a wave of next-generation reactor approvals moves forward across Europe, North America, and East Asia, reversing the post-Chernobyl stagnation that defined the earlier millennium. The shock to fossil fuel markets forces a fundamental strategic recalculation among hydrocarbon-dependent states. OPEC members and major non-OPEC exporters confront a plateauing demand curve for crude oil, stripping away the long-standing assumption of perpetual consumption growth. Rather than relying on production quotas to manage price volatility, major exporters initiate aggressive economic diversification strategies a full generation earlier than in our timeline. Sovereign wealth funds, traditionally allocated to Western equities and foreign real estate, pivot toward domestic infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and clean technology ventures. Gulf states accelerate investments in desalination, concentrated solar projects, and financial services hubs, recognizing that long-term geopolitical relevance will depend on post-oil economic resilience. This transition is uneven and internally contested. Rentier states with weaker institutional capacity struggle to translate fiscal windfalls into productive diversification, while those with stronger administrative frameworks use the transition as a catalyst for structural reform. The geopolitical center of gravity begins to shift from resource extraction to technological and financial adaptability. Nowhere is this strategic adaptation more pronounced than in China. The negotiated grace period on full carbon liability buys critical time, but Beijing interprets the global price signal as an unambiguous warning about future industrial competitiveness. Rather than resisting the transition, the state orchestrates a coordinated green leapfrog. Carbon revenues, supplemented by state-directed credit and targeted industrial policy, are funneled into massive domestic infrastructure upgrades, electrified urban rail networks, and early-stage battery material supply chains. Chinese manufacturers leverage scale, coordinated financing, and vertically integrated production lines to dominate the emerging global markets for solar panels, lithium-ion cells, and power electronics. This is not accidental market capture. It is a deliberate strategic response to a globally distorted playing field. By positioning itself as the world low-carbon manufacturing hub, China transforms a potential competitive disadvantage into a structural export advantage. Yet this trajectory carries significant internal risk. The assumption that political leadership will prioritize long-term industrial modernization over short-term growth stability remains fragile. Overcapacity, mounting debt in state-backed green sectors, and domestic inflationary pressures could fracture the consensus and trigger policy recalibration. The scenario assumes disciplined capital allocation and sustained political continuity, which history shows is never guaranteed. The rapid divergence in carbon pricing and industrial strategy inevitably spills over into the global trading system. As participating economies implement carbon border adjustments, the first major trade friction emerges. Exporters from non-compliant or partially compliant jurisdictions face steep levies designed to neutralize the competitive advantage of unpriced emissions. The resulting disputes test the limits of international trade law. The World Trade Organization, navigating unprecedented economic and diplomatic pressure, issues a landmark ruling that formally recognizes carbon border measures as legitimate environmental trade policy, provided they are applied transparently and without discriminatory intent. This decision effectively codifies climate compliance as a prerequisite for preferential market access. A de facto climate club crystallizes, linking trade privileges, regulatory harmonization, and shared green financing mechanisms. Nations outside this framework face escalating marginalization, forced to either accelerate their own decarbonization or accept permanent exclusion from high-value supply chains. The global trading system is no longer organized solely around comparative advantage in labor and capital. It is increasingly structured around carbon intensity, technological readiness, and regulatory alignment. Within this new architecture, distinct regional specializations emerge, driven by institutional strengths, capital market structures, and policy design. The European Union consolidates its leadership in offshore wind engineering, cross-border grid integration, and regulatory standard setting, leveraging coordinated energy policy to create a unified continental market for low-carbon infrastructure. The United States, benefiting from deep venture capital networks, software expertise, and a culture of entrepreneurial risk-taking, becomes the dominant force in grid-scale energy storage, smart grid management, and clean tech innovation financing. Silicon Valley's strategic pivot to climate technology accelerates, blending computational modeling, materials science, and systems optimization to drive down deployment costs. Meanwhile, China's dominance remains rooted in manufacturing scale, supply chain control, and state-coordinated deployment. The global clean technology sector is no longer a monolithic race. It is a multipolar ecosystem of interdependent but strategically competitive hubs. This specialization reduces systemic friction in the short term but plants the seeds for longer-term competition over technical standards, intellectual property rights, and critical mineral supply chains. The first decade of this alternate trajectory demonstrates that consistent carbon pricing can rapidly redirect capital flows, accelerate technological adoption, and force structural economic adaptation. However, the speed and stability of this transition rely on a set of conditional assumptions: sustained political commitment across electoral cycles, effective management of industrial dislocation, and the absence of severe macroeconomic shocks that could derail long-term investment horizons. The energy system is decarbonizing faster. Trade rules are being rewritten around climate metrics, and major powers are already positioning themselves for a post-fossil economy. Yet this represents only the surface layer of change. Beneath the energy and trade statistics, deeper second-order effects are taking root. The realignment of industrial capacity, the restructuring of international finance, and the emergence of new geopolitical blocs will soon force a fundamental reckoning over who controls the architecture of the 21st century economy. The carbon tax did not just change the price of emissions, it changed the rules of global competition. The decade spanning 2015 to 2025 marks the period where initial market adjustments harden into permanent structural realignments. The carbon tax is no longer a novel policy experiment. It is the invisible architecture of global commerce. By this stage, the economic signals have been consistent enough to rewire corporate strategy, reshape sovereign balance sheets, and redraw the fault lines of international power. What began as a pricing mechanism has evolved into a comprehensive framework for geopolitical competition, with climate alignment now functioning as the primary determinant of market access, investment flows, and diplomatic leverage. The most visible manifestation of this shift is the crystallization of competing economic blocs. On one side stands the High Ambition Coalition, a networked alliance of nations that have fully integrated carbon pricing into their fiscal and regulatory systems. This bloc operates through shared technical standards, harmonized border adjustments, and coordinated green financing initiatives. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank adapt to this new reality, embedding climate risk assessments into all sovereign lending frameworks and pioneering instruments like green special drawing rights to fund large-scale decarbonization in emerging markets. Debt for climate swaps become standard practice, linking fiscal relief to verifiable emissions reductions and infrastructure modernization. On the opposing side, a fragmented coalition of resource-dependent states and late industrializing economies struggles with the mounting costs of non-alignment. Some attempt to negotiate conditional access to the green trading system, while others resort to resource nationalism and bilateral hedging strategies. The global order is no longer defined by Cold War ideologies or purely economic liberalism. It is stratified by carbon compliance, technological readiness, and institutional capacity to navigate the energy transition. Within this stratified system, technological breakthroughs accelerate at a pace that defies the incremental timelines of the previous millennium. The sustained carbon price creates an unrelenting incentive for innovation, compressing research and development cycles through guaranteed market demand and predictable regulatory pathways. Electric vehicles reach purchase price parity with internal combustion models years ahead of historical projections, driven by battery chemistry improvements, scaled manufacturing, and the systemic phase-out of fossil fuel subsidies. By the middle of the decade, major automotive markets announced binding timelines to end the sale of new combustion vehicles, a policy shift that would have been politically unthinkable in an alternative timeline. Grid-scale energy storage follows a parallel trajectory, transitioning from a niche balancing tool to the foundational infrastructure for renewable-dominated power systems. Lithium-ion dominance gives way to diversified chemistries, including sodium-ion and solid-state variants, as supply chain diversification becomes a national security priority. Perhaps most transformative is the commercialization of green hydrogen. Supported by sustained carbon pricing and targeted public procurement, electrolyzer costs plummet, making zero-carbon hydrogen economically viable for heavy industry, maritime shipping, and long-haul aviation. Simultaneously, carbon capture and storage moves from pilot projects to industrial-scale deployment in cement, steel, and chemical manufacturing. These technologies are not miraculous inventions. They are the direct result of consistent market signals, predictable policy environments, and decades of accumulated learning curve effects. Yet this trajectory carries inherent uncertainty. The pace of innovation depends on uninterrupted R&D funding, stable supply chains for critical minerals, and the absence of severe macroeconomic disruptions. A prolonged financial crisis, geopolitical trade wars over battery materials, or technological bottlenecks in grid integration could significantly delay these milestones. The economic consequences of this technological acceleration are profoundly divergent. Early adopting economies that invested heavily in human capital, grid modernization, and advanced manufacturing reap what economists term an innovation dividend. Productivity growth rebounds as clean infrastructure reduces systemic inefficiencies, public health expenditures decline due to improved air quality, and energy independence insulates national economies from volatile hydrocarbon markets. These nations transition from defensive climate compliance to offensive economic strategy, exporting high-value clean technologies, setting international standards, and capturing the financial architecture of the green transition. The opposite dynamic unfolds for latecomers and non-compliant jurisdictions. Stranded fossil assets accumulate at an accelerating rate, forcing sovereign debt restructurings and abrupt fiscal contractions. Industrial sectors that delayed decarbonization face steep catch-up costs, as retrofitting legacy infrastructure proves exponentially more expensive than building new low-carbon systems from the ground up. The Global South occupies the most precarious position in this divergence. Nations with access to targeted climate finance, technology transfer agreements, and favorable carbon revenue-sharing mechanisms successfully leapfrog traditional industrial pathways, deploying distributed renewable grids and modernizing urban infrastructure without the carbon lock-in that constrained previous development cycles. Others, particularly those excluded from green financing networks or burdened by carbon border adjustments on early-stage exports, face a brutal developmental squeeze. The assumption that international climate institutions will deliver equitable capital distribution remains a critical vulnerability in this scenario. If revenue recycling and technology transfer mechanisms are captured by domestic elites, undermined by bureaucratic inefficiency, or weaponized through conditional lending, the global transition risks cementing a new form of technological dependency rather than fostering genuine convergence. By 2025, the second-order effects of the global carbon tax have fundamentally rewritten the rules of economic statecraft. The competition for geopolitical influence no longer revolves around securing oil pipelines or projecting naval power into hydrocarbon choke points. It centers on controlling critical mineral supply chains, dominating battery intellectual property, setting digital grid cybersecurity standards, and verifying carbon removal methodologies. The carbon price has done more than reduce emissions. It has realigned incentives, accelerated technological substitution, and created a new hierarchy of national competitiveness grounded in climate readiness and industrial adaptability. The world is more integrated through green trade networks, yet more stratified by technological capacity and institutional discipline. The transition has not eliminated friction, it has simply relocated it. The decade proves that consistent pricing can drive systemic transformation, but it also reveals that the political management of industrial disruption, equitable capital allocation, and technological access will determine whether this new architecture stabilizes global competition or fractures it into competing technological spheres. The foundations are set. The next phase will test whether regional powers can adapt to this new reality, or whether the pressures of divergence will force a fundamental renegotiation of the global order. The regional consequences of a global carbon tax implemented in 2000 reveal a world of stark divergence, where national trajectories are reshaped not by geography or culture alone, but by the strategic choices made in response to a unified price signal. In the United States, the political economy of climate policy undergoes a fundamental transformation. With American participation secured at the point of divergence, climate action ceases to be a polarized cultural issue and evolves into a bipartisan project of industrial modernization. The Rust Belt, rather than continuing its post-industrial decline, becomes a laboratory for advanced manufacturing, with federal carbon revenues co-invested alongside private capital to retrofit steel mills, automate precision component production, and train a new generation of technicians in low-carbon processes. Texas, historically the heartland of American oil, leveraged its engineering expertise, land abundance, and pro-business regulatory culture to become a global hub for wind power, green hydrogen production, and carbon capture infrastructure. Geopolitically, the United States finds its strategic focus shifting away from the security of Middle Eastern oil lanes toward competition over technological standards, intellectual property regimes, and the governance of digital grid infrastructure. Energy independence, achieved earlier and through diversified sources, reduces the imperative for military engagement in hydrocarbon regions, allowing Washington to concentrate diplomatic and economic statecraft on shaping the rules of the emerging clean technology order. Yet this trajectory assumes a level of political continuity and institutional capacity that is never guaranteed. The scenario presumes that revenue recycling mechanisms effectively cushion transitional shocks, that workforce development programs keep pace with industrial change, and that political coalitions remain stable across electoral cycles. A severe recession, a populist backlash against perceived elite consensus, or a foreign policy crisis could fracture this delicate alignment and trigger policy volatility. China's path represents the most strategically consequential adaptation. Beijing approaches the global carbon price not as an external constraint but as a strategic signal about the future determinants of industrial power. The negotiated grace period provides critical breathing room, but Chinese policymakers recognize that long-term competitiveness will hinge on carbon intensity, supply chain efficiency, and technological sovereignty. The state orchestrates a coordinated green leapfrog, directing carbon revenues, state-backed credit, and targeted industrial policy toward massive domestic infrastructure upgrades, electrified urban transit networks, and early-stage dominance in battery materials, power electronics, and solar manufacturing. This is not passive market response. It is active statecraft designed to turn a potential disadvantage into a structural export advantage. By the mid-2020s, China emerges as the world's largest producer and deployer of clean technologies, leveraging scale, vertical integration, and coordinated financing to set global cost curves. Simultaneously, Beijing reorients its Belt and Road Initiative around a green edition, offering developing nations financing for renewable infrastructure, grid modernization, and climate-resilient agriculture, thereby expanding its diplomatic influence through climate-aligned development. However, this path carries significant internal tension. The assumption that political leadership will consistently prioritize long-term industrial modernization over short-term growth stability, employment targets, and regional equity is fragile. Overcapacity in state-subsidized green sectors, mounting local government debt, inflationary pressures from rapid transition, or social unrest in fossil-dependent regions could fracture the consensus and trigger policy recalibration. The scenario assumes disciplined capital allocation and sustained political continuity, which history shows is never guaranteed. The European Union experiences the carbon tax as both a catalyst for deeper integration and a source of internal strain. The harmonized pricing mechanism strengthens the logic of single market coordination, pushing member states toward greater fiscal alignment, shared energy infrastructure planning, and common regulatory standards for green technologies. The euro evolves to incorporate climate metrics, with the European Central Bank integrating carbon risk into asset purchase programs and the emergence of a green euro as a preferred currency for climate finance and sustainable bond issuance. Yet the transition is uneven across the continent. Western European nations with advanced service economies and strong social safety nets manage the industrial shift with relative stability, while Eastern European members with heavier reliance on coal and legacy manufacturing face acute dislocation. The EU's Just Transition mechanism, funded in part by carbon revenues, becomes a critical test of solidarity, determining whether the Union can manage asymmetric shocks without fracturing political cohesion. Externally, Europe leveraged its regulatory power and market size to set global standards for product carbon footprints, circular economy design, and sustainable finance taxonomy, exporting its governance model through trade agreements. However, the bloc also confronts new migration pressures, as climate impacts in vulnerable regions accelerate population movements toward Europe's borders, testing the limits of its humanitarian and security frameworks. The Middle East and OPEC-producing states face an existential strategic reckoning. The global carbon tax accelerates the plateauing of oil demand, stripping away the long-standing assumption of perpetual consumption growth that underpinned rentier state economics. The response is sharply divergent. Gulf monarchies with strong institutional capacity, substantial sovereign wealth, and visionary leadership, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, initiate aggressive diversification strategies a full generation earlier than in our timeline. They pivot sovereign investments toward renewable energy projects, green hydrogen production, advanced manufacturing, and knowledge economy sectors, recognizing that long-term geopolitical relevance will depend on post-oil economic resilience. These states also leverage their geographic advantage in solar irradiance and existing energy infrastructure to position themselves as future exporters of clean electrons and molecules. Conversely, petrostates with weaker governance, higher fiscal break-even prices, or entrenched political economies, such as Iran, Venezuela, or Nigeria, struggle to adapt. Declining oil revenues exacerbate fiscal deficits, social spending cuts, and political instability, leading to deeper crises and increased regional volatility. The geopolitical center of gravity in the region begins to shift from control of oil choke points to competition over critical mineral access, desalination technology, and climate adaptation finance. Africa and the broader global south occupy the most precarious and contingent position in this alternate timeline. For nations with access to targeted climate finance, technology transfer agreements, and favorable carbon revenue sharing mechanisms, the early global carbon price presents a historic opportunity to leapfrog carbon-intensive development pathways. Distributed renewable energy systems, modernized agricultural practices, and climate-resilient infrastructure can be deployed without the lock-in effects that constrained previous industrialization cycles. Nations endowed with critical minerals for clean technologies, such as cobalt, lithium, or rare earth elements, can potentially capture greater value through local processing and strategic partnerships. However, this optimistic trajectory hinges on a critical assumption that the international institutions governing carbon revenue distribution and technology transfer operate with effectiveness, transparency, and equity. If these mechanisms are captured by domestic elites, undermined by bureaucratic inefficiency, or weaponized through conditional lending that prioritizes donor interests over recipient needs, the global transition risks cementing a new form of technological dependency. Furthermore, carbon border adjustments, while designed to prevent leakage, could inadvertently penalize early-stage industrial exporters from the global south if not accompanied by targeted support, capacity building, and grace periods. The scenario thus presents a fundamental fork. A globally coordinated carbon tax could either accelerate equitable development through deliberate resource redistribution, or it could exacerbate existing inequalities if the governance of the transition fails to prioritize justice and inclusion. The regional case studies collectively demonstrate that a single global policy lever does not produce uniform outcomes. It interacts with pre-existing institutional capacities, political economies, and strategic cultures to generate a complex mosaic of adaptation, opportunity, and vulnerability. The transformation of the global system during this period is not merely economic or environmental. It is fundamentally architectural. The institutions designed to manage a 20th century world of open markets, dollar liquidity, and fossil fuel security are forced to adapt or risk irrelevance. The World Trade Organization, once primarily concerned with tariff reduction and subsidy discipline, becomes the central arena for climate trade arbitration. Carbon border adjustments, initially challenged as disguised protectionism, are gradually normalized into the operational rules of international commerce. Specialized dispute panels emerge to adjudicate emissions accounting methodologies, verify compliance equivalency across jurisdictions, and prevent discriminatory application of climate tariffs. This institutional evolution signals a profound structural shift. Preferential market access is no longer guaranteed solely by comparative advantage in labor or capital, but by demonstrable alignment with decarbonization standards. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank undergo parallel metamorphosis. Climate risk transitions from a peripheral environmental consideration to a core macroeconomic variable embedded in sovereign lending frameworks. National balance sheets are stress-tested against both transition shocks and physical climate damages, with carbon intensity metrics directly influencing credit ratings and borrowing costs. Green special drawing rights are deployed to direct liquidity toward large-scale decarbonization, while debt-for-climate swaps become standard instruments for emerging markets seeking fiscal relief without abandoning modernization targets. The World Bank shifts its portfolio decisively toward climate-resilient infrastructure, cross-border grid modernization, and adaptive agricultural systems, recognizing that 21st century development is inextricably linked to climate readiness. Yet this institutional transformation carries significant vulnerability. The assumption that multilateral financial institutions can maintain technical neutrality while enforcing politically sensitive climate conditionality is fragile. If lending terms are perceived as coercive, culturally dismissive, or disproportionately burdensome, the resulting backlash could fracture the very cooperation these institutions are designed to sustain. The carbon tax, originally conceived as a neutral market mechanism to price externalities, rapidly evolves into a sophisticated instrument of geopolitical statecraft. High-ambition coalitions leverage market access as both incentive and deterrent, offering preferential trade terms, streamlined technology transfer pathways, and green financing to compliant states while imposing escalating border adjustments on jurisdictions that delay or evade compliance. This creates a new hierarchy of economic sovereignty, where regulatory alignment dictates integration into the most valuable global supply chains. Climate compliance becomes entangled with diplomatic positioning, giving rise to informal climate sanctions that target nations engaged in systemic deforestation, unchecked methane venting, or aggressive fossil fuel subsidy dumping. The realist logic underlying this shift is unambiguous. States that control verification technologies, carbon accounting standards, and the financial architecture of the transition wield disproportionate influence over global commerce. Liberal institutionalism provides the frameworks for dispute resolution and revenue sharing, but the underlying power dynamics remain rooted in economic leverage and regulatory dominance. The most profound transformation is the complete reorientation of geopolitical competition itself. The previous century was defined by the security of oil choke points, petrostate diplomacy, and naval power projection into hydrocarbon basins. The emerging order is structured around critical mineral supply chains, battery intellectual property, grid cybersecurity, and carbon removal verification. Control over lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements becomes as strategically vital as control over Middle Eastern oil fields once was. Nations race to secure mining concessions, establish domestic processing capacity, and build closed-loop recycling ecosystems to mitigate supply chain vulnerability. Simultaneously, competition migrates to the governance layer. Technical standard setting for smart grids, certification of carbon accounting methodologies, and development of the software that optimizes renewable integration become the new arenas of strategic influence. The geography of power relocates from desert extraction zones to mining basins, research campuses, and data centers managing complex energy networks. This systemic transformation is not inherently stabilizing. While coordinated climate governance could theoretically reduce resource-driven conflicts by aligning economic incentives with planetary boundaries, it equally risks fragmenting the global order into competing technological spheres. Green protectionism, standards wars, and the strategic weaponization of climate finance could recreate the very bloc rivalries the framework was designed to transcend. The scenario assumes that institutional evolution outpaces geopolitical fragmentation, that verification regimes maintain technical credibility and political legitimacy, and that economic interdependence in clean technologies fosters cooperation rather than coercion. History offers no guarantee. The global system is being rewired around carbon pricing, electrons, and data rather than hydrocarbons and pipelines, but the human drivers of ambition, strategic competition, and institutional inertia remain unchanged. The question is no longer whether the architecture of global power has shifted, but whether the new rules will manage that power or amplify its fractures. Any credible exploration of this alternate timeline must confront a fundamental truth. The path from policy implementation to systemic transformation is not predetermined. The scenario we have traced depends on a series of contingent assumptions, each of which carries the potential to fracture the projected trajectory. The most critical uncertainty lies in the realm of compliance. A global carbon tax only functions if major emitters participate consistently and enforce its provisions domestically. In this timeline, we assumed that the economic and diplomatic costs of non-participation would outweigh the short-term pain of compliance. But what if that calculus reverses? A populist political shift in a key economy, a severe financial crisis that prioritizes immediate growth over long-term transition, or a geopolitical realignment that weaponizes energy dependence could trigger withdrawal, non-enforcement, or systematic cheating. The free rider problem, a classic challenge in collective action theory, does not disappear because a price is set. If major jurisdictions begin to covertly subsidize carbon-intensive exports or manipulate emissions accounting, the integrity of the entire framework erodes. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, and the regime could collapse into a patchwork of competing standards and retaliatory border measures. Technological progress represents another axis of profound uncertainty. Our projections assume that sustained carbon pricing compresses innovation cycles through predictable market signals and accumulated learning effects. But technological breakthroughs are not linear. They emerge from complex interactions between basic research, entrepreneurial risk-taking, supply chain development, and serendipity. What if battery chemistry advances more slowly than anticipated, delaying electric vehicle cost parity and grid-scale storage deployment? What if grid integration challenges, managing intermittency, ensuring cybersecurity, upgrading transmission infrastructure, prove more complex and costly than modeled? Conversely, what if an unexpected breakthrough in fusion energy, advanced geothermal, or direct air capture arrives earlier than projected, dramatically accelerating the transition and reshaping competitive dynamics? The scenario is sensitive to the pace of substitution. Faster innovation could reduce political friction by lowering transition costs. Slower progress could amplify economic dislocation and fuel backlash against the policy framework itself. Political regime changes and exogenous shocks introduce further volatility. The timeline from 2000 to 2025 encompasses events that, in our reality, profoundly reshaped global priorities: the September 11th attacks, the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of populist nationalism, and a global pandemic. In this alternate history, would a major security crisis have reinforced climate cooperation as a shared challenge, or would it have diverted political capital, fiscal resources, and diplomatic attention away from long-term decarbonization? Would a severe global recession have triggered protectionist retreats that fractured the climate club, or would it have accelerated green stimulus as a pathway to recovery? The assumption of sustained political continuity across electoral cycles is particularly fragile. Climate policy requires decades-long horizons, but democratic politics often operates on much shorter timeframes. A single election in a pivotal economy could alter commitment levels, revenue recycling mechanisms, or border adjustment enforcement, sending ripple effects through global markets and diplomatic alignments. A rigorous sensitivity analysis requires stress testing the scenario against variations in its core parameters. What if the carbon tax escalation rate is capped at $30 per ton due to political pressure, rather than following the assumed 5% annual real increase? The transition would proceed, but at a markedly slower pace, allowing more time for adaptation but also prolonging exposure to climate damages and delaying the innovation dividend. What if revenue recycling mechanisms prove ineffective, with funds captured by domestic political interests or misallocated to unproductive investments? The social license for the policy could erode, particularly in regions bearing disproportionate transition costs. What if China's strategic calculus shifts, prioritizing short-term growth stability over long-term technological sovereignty. A pivot toward defensive industrial policy, capital controls, or technology decoupling could fragment the global clean technology ecosystem into competing spheres, reducing the efficiency gains from integrated supply chains and shared standards. We can conceptualize these uncertainties through a scenario matrix. In a best-case convergence, high compliance levels, accelerated technological breakthroughs, and stable political commitment reinforce one another. Emissions decline rapidly, innovation dividends boost productivity, and climate cooperation builds trust that spills over into other areas of global governance. The world moves toward a more stable, rules-based order centered on decarbonized prosperity. In a worst-case fragmentation, compliance falters, technological progress stalls, and political shocks trigger retreats into green protectionism. Carbon border measures become weapons of economic statecraft, technology standards splinter into incompatible blocks, and the global order fractures into competing spheres defined by regulatory alignment rather than shared rules. The most likely outcome, however, resides in the complex middle, uneven progress, regional divergence, and continuous negotiation over the terms of the transition. Some regions accelerate ahead, others lag, and the international system adapts imperfectly to manage the resulting frictions. This analytical humility is essential. Alternate history is not prediction. It is a tool for stress-testing assumptions and illuminating the causal pathways that link policy choices to systemic outcomes. The key lesson from this sensitivity analysis is that the value of a global carbon tax implemented in 2000 would have depended less on the elegance of its design and more on the political, technological, and institutional ecosystems that surrounded its implementation. The price signal is necessary but not sufficient. Its ultimate impact hinges on governance quality, equity mechanisms, adaptive capacity, and the ability to maintain coalition cohesion across decades of change. Recognizing these uncertainties does not weaken the scenario. It strengthens its analytical credibility by acknowledging that the future, whether real or imagined, is always contingent on choices yet unmade and challenges yet unmet. Assessing the net outcome of a global carbon tax implemented in the year 2000 requires moving beyond simplistic binaries. This policy would not have delivered a utopian equilibrium, nor would it have triggered systemic economic collapse. Instead, it would have accelerated the fundamental realignment of global power, industrial structure, and environmental trajectory. The central question is whether that acceleration produces a more stable world or a more fractured one. The analytical evidence points to conditional stability. A harmonized pricing mechanism, backed by institutionalized dispute resolution, shared climate finance, and transparent verification regimes, creates powerful incentives for sustained cooperation. States locked into interdependent supply chains for clean technologies, grid infrastructure, and critical minerals develop vested interests in maintaining predictable rules and open commercial channels. Yet the same architecture that enables cooperation also generates new fault lines. Carbon border adjustments, technical standard setting, and strategic control over emissions accounting become instruments of economic statecraft. The world avoids the destabilizing shocks of late-century climate disruption and fossil fuel volatility, but it inherits a landscape of intense, rules-based competition where climate compliance dictates market access, investment flows, and diplomatic leverage. On the axis of global equality, the outcome hinges almost entirely on governance design and institutional execution. In theory, a globally coordinated carbon framework redistributes wealth through structured revenue recycling, technology transfer agreements, and debt-for-climate mechanisms. Vulnerable nations that leapfrog to distributed renewable systems and receive targeted adaptation finance avoid the carbon lock-in that historically constrained development. The avoided costs of extreme weather, agricultural collapse, sea level rise, and climate-driven migration represent a profound, albeit indirect, equalizing force that disproportionately benefits regions most exposed to physical climate risk. However, the structural risks are severe and cannot be dismissed. If revenue distribution is captured by domestic political elites, if green financing arrives with coercive conditionalities, or if carbon border measures penalize early-stage industrial exporters without compensatory capacity building, the transition risks cementing a new hierarchy of technological dependency. The gap between nations that control clean technology intellectual property and those that merely import finished systems could widen rather than narrow. Global equality is not an automatic byproduct of carbon pricing. It is a deliberate political choice embedded in treaty design and institutional oversight. The net impact on climate and the global economy presents a clear asymmetry. Short-term economic friction traded for long-term systemic resilience. Macroeconomic modeling of highly aggressive carbon pricing consistently shows a modest drag on aggregate growth during the initial decade, driven by rapid capital reallocation, stranded asset write-downs, and transitional price adjustments. Yet this cost is systematically offset by compounding innovation dividend, accelerated deployment of renewables, transportation electrification, and industrial process efficiency reduces long-term energy volatility, lowers public health expenditures from air pollution, and insulates national economies from geopolitical hydrocarbon shocks. Crucially, the climate benefit is substantial. An additional quarter-century of consistent carbon pricing would have avoided hundreds of gigatons of cumulative emissions, likely limiting global temperature rise by several tenths of a degree compared to our historical trajectory. While it would not have single-handedly solved climate change or eliminated the need for adaptation, it would have shifted the atmospheric curve decisively, buying critical decades for infrastructure hardening and significantly reducing the probability of crossing irreversible ecological tipping points. The economic ledger balances not because the transition is cheap, but because delayed action proves exponentially more expensive in both human and financial terms. Identifying the ultimate beneficiaries requires looking beyond national borders to structural positions within the new economic architecture. The clear winners are nations and firms that invested early in human capital, grid modernization, and advanced manufacturing. Countries that successfully retrained workforces, scaled clean technology production, and embedded sustainability into corporate governance captured disproportionate market share and long-term pricing power. Financial systems that integrated carbon risk into asset valuation avoided catastrophic balance sheet collapses from stranded fossil assets. Future generations inherit a more predictable climate, lower systemic energy costs, and a global order less dependent on resource extraction and military securitization of hydrocarbon routes. The structural losers are incumbent extraction economies that fail to diversify, regions with high transition costs and weak institutional capacity to manage industrial dislocation, and political coalitions that prioritize short-term revenue capture over long-term competitiveness. Yet even these losses represent a reallocation of capital rather than its destruction. The wealth historically generated from fossil extraction is simply redirected toward efficiency, innovation, and systemic resilience. The final assessment of this alternate timeline is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of strategic consequence. A global carbon tax implemented in 2000 would have forced the international system to internalize the true cost of carbon before climate disruption became unmanageable and before clean technologies reached commercial maturity through fragmented, inefficient subsidies. It would have made the energy transition more orderly, less chaotic, and fundamentally more predictable. Yet it would not have erased geopolitical competition, political friction, or the hard trade-offs inherent in industrial transformation. The policy succeeds not by eliminating conflict, but by channeling it into productive arenas, innovation races, standards development, and institutional negotiation rather than resource wars and climate abandonment. In the end, the world shaped by this decision is neither perfectly stable nor fundamentally equal. It is a world that chose to price the future, accepted the immediate costs of doing so, and in return, built an economic architecture aligned with planetary boundaries rather than opposed to them. Whether that represents foresight or necessity depends on where you stand in the distribution of gains and losses. But strategically, it represents a divergence where the rules of the game were rewritten before the board was already lost. If a single policy lever pulled in the year 2000 could have fundamentally reshaped the climate, the global economy, and the balance of international power, what does that reveal about the choices we are making today? The alternate history we have explored is not an exercise in nostalgia or regret. It is a stress test for our current assumptions. It demonstrates that the timeline we inhabit was not inevitable. The delays, the fragmented efforts, and the reactive scrambling that defined real-world climate policy were the result of specific political calculations, institutional failures, and strategic hesitations. In this counterfactual, those barriers were overcome not by magic, but by coordinated statecraft and the willingness to price long-term risk before it became an immediate crisis. The lesson is not that the past can be changed, but that the future remains unwritten. We stand at a similar inflection point now. The technologies that seemed distant in 2000 are commercially viable today. The institutional frameworks that struggled then are more robust, if still imperfect. The economic logic of decarbonization is no longer theoretical. It is embedded in market realities. Yet the political will to act with the same decisiveness imagined in this scenario remains the critical variable. Current carbon pricing mechanisms cover only a fraction of global emissions, and geopolitical competition often overshadows collective action. The divergence between where we are and where we could have been is a measure of the cost of hesitation. Alternate history serves as a mirror. It reflects not what happened, but what was possible. It challenges us to recognize that policy decisions are not merely technical adjustments. They are geopolitical acts that define the structure of power and prosperity for generations. The next divergence point is not in the past. It is here, in the present moment, in the policies we adopt, the alliances we forge, and the risks we choose to price. The question is no longer what might have been. The question is what we will do with the time we have left.